There he is.
What's up, Matt?
How are you doing?
Hey, man. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Been a
How
while since I saw. Well, hey, we golfed together.
we sure did. Yeah, not too long
That was
ago, and
fun
yeah, that was fun. Now you're back in Chicago.
in
You've
Nashville.
whipped out the beanie. Is it that time of the year
It's that
up
time of
there?
year. It's dropped to like 35 degrees here. Bizarre. But you know what? This weekend it's supposed to be 60, so it's confusing.
Oh gosh. Well, we'll take it as long as we can get it.
So,
Cool.
what do we got today? We're gonna
Yeah,
take
you got a
some maybe
handful.
some live questions if we have them.
Yeah, for sure. If any of you guys watching have questions, drop them in the chat or in this little questions box, and we can circle back to those or get to them
Cool,
as they come. But yeah, we've got a handful here. We can just jump right in.
cool.
Our first question is, what tips do you have for keeping your band on a click track?
Ooh, that's a pretty common question.
Mhm.
It's a good question for anybody using tracks.
Yeah.
Um, so this sounds so basic, but make sure they can hear it. I find that a lot of times bands struggle to stay on time with the click because they just can't hear it. And they
Yeah.
may not actually tell you. Like they're wearing in your monitors, and a lot of times people just have a hard time actually hearing the click
Hmm.
because, and this goes to my next thing, they don't know how to actually mix in your monitors. So they're in your monitor mixes. I mean, how many times I can just totally picture so many times volunteers like just kind of playing around with their like volume pack and playing
Oh
with their
yeah.
ears. And you can just tell like they're uncomfortable. You can
Yeah.
tell they can't
Right.
hear themselves. They're like really struggling. And it's because a lot of times they don't know how to make an in-ear monitor mix that actually sounds good. We do not spend enough time training our volunteers how to actually make a mix. It's funny because we basically put a little mini, mixer in front of every person in our band and expect that they know how to mix sound. Like all of a sudden they're like the sound team and they know how to mix. Most musicians haven't been trained at all on how to mix.
Mm.
So I would say that it's so important to provide training to your band members on how to make a decent in-ear monitor mix. Teach them
Yeah.
about gain
Yeah.
structure. Teach them about panning the audio. Teach them about all the knobs on that mixer and what they do. There's that one on some mixers that say like enhance. It doesn't enhance anything. In fact, it makes it way worse. Teach them that they should not use the enhance knob or the
That's
compressor
funny.
knob.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
because I just really think that we're doing them a disservice by not teaching them how to actually make a mix. And if they know how to make a mix, they can make the click sit in a place where they can really
Yeah.
hear it well.
Yeah.
And hearing the click is very important for staying on the click.
It's very true.
Believe it or
Yeah.
not. Believe it or not,
Yeah.
Matt.
And also,
Be-
I mean, like in my, I've even had experiences like early on in the days where it's like in rehearsal, you think your mix is good, and then you get into the service and so many other things are happening. The click gets lost, maybe not audibly, but just mentally you're not there. So it's like just give that click an extra little bump just so you can hear it front and center, even despite all the
totally.
other craziness that's going on. So that's good. Just
I
turn up the click.
turn it up. I would think also it's really helpful is putting the click on its own channel.
Mm,
So if you can on your inner monitor system, put the click separate from the cues because then they can adjust. A lot of times people turn.
mm,
I've noticed people turn the click down because they like the cues are too loud and that like bothers them.
mm.
Intro 2, 3, 4. So if you can just separate them out so that then they can adjust the click and the cues separately.
Yeah.
And then of course also encourage your band to practice at home to a click. And with prime teams, you can actually send the set list out ahead of time to everybody and they could use the Prime app and practice along with a click at home. And the more you practice with the click,
Yeah.
the more it feels like second nature. It's like riding a bike, and you don't even realize the click is even there.
Mm. Yeah. Practice is huge as well, for
Yeah.
sure. Um, cool. Yeah. So, I mean, you kind of, I mean, our second question that we had, you kind of hit on what tips do you have for mixing tracks? Is there anything else you would say to amend this first question about
Well, I think
mixing?
this would go. I think actually, let's take this a different direction. Mixing tracks for the audience. Let's talk about that. So this isn't
Okay.
like mixing tracks for your monitors. This is
Yeah.
if you're setting up Prime or Ableton Live. and you're going to be running tracks through a sound system,
Mm.
let's talk about how you actually mix the tracks so that they sound
Yeah.
good in the sound system. Um, I would say that ideally you're not mixing the tracks on the iPad or at the Ableton level. Ideally, you're sending all the tracks separately using something like TrackRig to the sound system so that the sound team can mix the tracks.
Mm.
Because it's going to sound totally different on your computer than it does through the sound system. And so giving the sound team the ability to adjust the volume of the tambourine and the guitars and the shaker is going to be massive, because it's a totally different environment than when you mixed it in your church office before you went out on stage.
Mm.
So if you can, send the tracks individually through a track rig so the sound team can mix it. If not, though, let's just say that you are using a headphone jack and you're sending them a full mix of tracks, then I would say that less is more. And I would not use too many tracks, because what can happen is it can get really muddy and
Yeah.
muddled. And less is more. If you're using the headphone jack and you're just sending them like a full mix of tracks that the sound team just has to turn everything up and everything down, then less is more. Keep it
Yeah.
simple, because that way they can really they can EQ it better.
Yeah.
Also
Yeah.
avoid duplicating anything.
Mm.
If you have a piano player in your band, do not use a piano track.
Mm.
I've done that before. And first of all, it makes your piano player very upset. And depending on how passive aggressive they are, they will tell you that or not. And also, you can hear the duplication. And
Yeah.
because they're not going to play the parts exactly the
Right.
same at the exact same time, you actually end up hearing like a ta-ta. And
Yeah. Yeah.
it sounds bad. It makes the computer sound bad, and it makes the real piano
Right.
player sound bad. So avoid duplicating anything. Don't If you have a lead guitar player, do not use the lead electric guitar track.
Mm.
It'll make it worse. It's kind of like the law of diminishing returns. At some point, if you had too much stuff, it actually ends up making the mix sound worse.
Man.
Trying to think what else. Also, a key with mixing tracks is making sure that the volume across all the songs is the same. Because what you don't want to have happen is one track is really quiet, the next track is really loud, and your sound team is like turning things up and down.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, they might just turn it down and never turn it back up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what I would do is, if you're using Prime, all I would do is every song has a master fader. Right above the play button, there's a master fader. And that master fader adjusts the overall gain of the whole song.
Mm.
What I would do is just quickly, before sound check, hit play on each one and adjust that master fader until all the songs are at the same
Yeah.
level. And that way, when you're playing through the set list, your sound team's not having to scramble trying to figure out the mix. And so I know, hey, Robert Titian, man, love you, bro. You know exactly what I'm talking about, gain structure. That guy's a master at mixing. So he knows
That's
how important
awesome.
that is.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Hey, I've got more, Matt. Another tip would be that if you're using the headphone jack, keep the iPad volume or your Mac volume to, I would say, 85%. I've seen worship leaders turn the iPad volume all the way up 100% or the Mac volume all the way up 100%. That can actually cause distortion.
Mm.
So to avoid any sort of distortion, keep it at like 75, 80% in that level.
Yeah. Yeah.
That way you're leaving some headroom so that when these tracks are playing, you're not going to be crushing the headphone jack and it's not going to be distorting.
Mm.
So I always keep it visually, I always see it like, how like Apple has like those three dots. I don't even know if they
Yeah.
have that anymore. Actually, it might be totally different now. I'm checking. Yeah, no, there are the little dots. I always leave the
Right.
three dots empty at the end.
Okay.
So I don't know if
Okay.
that's like 80%, 85%. I
Yeah.
always
How
leave
much
three
is?
dots empty at the end.
No, that's a great rule of thumb.
And if you're using an interface like TrackRig, keep your
Mm-hmm.
groupings simple.
Yeah.
So put all the guitars down one group, all the percussion down one group. You don't have to get too crazy on this. You don't have to send 16 outputs, even 8 outputs. Honestly, when I lead worship, I use 4 outputs. I always send guitars out of their own output. I send keyboards out of their own output, and I send percussion out of its own output.
Yeah.
And just doing that is going to be a big time difference mix wise than using the headphone jack.
For sure. Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. I think it's, gosh, the mixing thing is so valuable, even like for musicians, because it's like a lot of what you're doing as a worship musician, you're contributing, what your instrument contributes is very much like it's very much
Yeah.
a mix, like I don't know how to explain it, but it's like, your guitar tone, for example, or like the keys, if like that's probably a better example, is like if you're playing a pad, it's like the dark pad, right? But if you want to add excitement, you can bring in the top end of that pad for more
Yeah.
like excitement and punch. And it's like I think the mix element, even for a musician, if you have a good handle on that stuff, will make you a much
It's
better
huge.
worship musician. So it's like not
But
only just for the people in the back, but it helps everyone if you have those basic kind of principles kind of down.
you and I both know that an in-ear monitor mix makes all the difference. Like there's
Yeah,
times when my in-ear monitor mix is horrible, and usually it's my own fault because I just didn't properly do a sound check with it. And it changes the whole vibe. Like it's just
yeah,
like, oh gosh, none of this sounds good. But really it's my own fault. Like I just didn't mix it
mm,
correctly. And you and I both know, probably volunteers, that most people don't know how to mix and make a
right,
good mix.
right,
And
right.
panning does huge
Mm,
use does wonders. Like even if you just like take the kick, keep the kick straight, maybe pan the snare a little bit to your left ear.
yeah,
I always pan electric guitars. If they're stereo electric guitars, I pan them
right.
left, right.
Mm-hmm.
If it's just one guitar, like a mono guitar, I always pan it right, all the
Okay.
way hard right. The more you can pan, the more space you
Yeah,
create in
get a
your inner
little more
monitor mix,
separation.
and it just sounds so much better.
Yeah.
And that's where then if you have the click dead center,
Mm,
you can hear it then perfectly. But it's because you've made space for it. But all that is just knowing how to create an inner monitor mix.
yeah,
And
for
we don't
sure.
train our volunteers that. We really should.
Yeah, man, we could do a whole seminar just on that if we wanted to. Maybe we should
Oh,
someday. Cool. Well, to keep it moving, if your drummer is running tracks and you want to repeat a chorus, how would you communicate that to them as a worship leader?
a good old fashioned
Yeah.
hand motion, right?
Yeah.
Repeat, repeat. No, one way that you could really do this that I think is pretty cool is you could get a Luptimus Mini like this, run this up by the worship leader, and assign one of these buttons to be repeat, like repeat section. And
Yeah.
that way, if the worship leader wanted to repeat a section, they don't have to even do any sort of hand motions at all. They can just press the repeat
Yeah. Hit
button,
the button.
and then Prime is going to say chorus 2, 3, 4, and
Right.
everybody in the band will then know exactly where to go. So you could
Mm,
totally use a Luptimus Mini to easily repeat a section and let the worship leader do it. So the iPad
yeah.
could still be backed by the drummer. Just put this by the
Yeah.
worship leader's foot, and then they have band directing control, basically.
Right. They both can kind of contribute.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great tip. Um, Yeah, very cool. The next question that we had kind of goes along with that. What are some best practices for where everything should sit on stage? So I don't know if this is referring
Yeah.
to where Prime's at or where your gear is located or something else, but
This is a good question and it really is different for every church and every worship leader depending on how they want to run tracks.
you know,
It's very important that the computer or iPad that you're using is accessible. Do not put the iPad backstage. I cannot tell you how many times there's been a situation where you get out there and all of a sudden you realize, wow, the computer went to sleep. Someone needs to go like put their fingerprint on it to unlock it or type the
yeah,
password
oh
in.
man,
Or wow, the computer died because of the battery, or a controller just stopped working for some reason and you need to be able to actually touch the device to get the
right,
tracks to start playing. You need your device accessible. So in case of an emergency, you want it right there by you. Don't put it backstage. I would not have the sound team run it.
yeah,
It
yeah,
needs to be accessible to people who are actually on the stage in case of emergency, because you also want to trim the time between noticing that there's an emergency and taking care of that emergency. And if you
right,
have the iPad backed by the sound team, if the band notices there's a problem, there's going to be a delay in communicating with the back to let them
yeah,
know what's happening, for them to
yeah,
communicate back. You really want to have it all in a controlled environment. So I would say keypad or the MacBook on a stand nearby the person running it. They make some really cool iPad stands that the iPad can just clip right into. Keep
Mm.
that right at like arm level of the person running it. If it's a MacBook and the drummer's running it, I've seen a lot of churches just have like a road case, backed by the drummer, and
Yeah.
put the computer right there so the drummer can quickly grab the
Yeah.
computer and do whatever needs to be done to make the tracks happen.
Mm.
You don't want it on the ground or far away.
Yeah.
Because even if the computer is on the ground, which I actually used to run my tracks and I would have them on the ground, even then, it's not as quickly accessible. You have to like get down on your knees,
Yeah. It's tough.
fiddle around and make it happen. If you can keep it at eye level or arm level at least, that will make all the difference. If the worship leader is running the tracks, I think it's great to even have them somewhere where you can see like an iPad stand because it also helps. It gives you a reference as you're leading worship. You can kind of see your set list. You can see where in the song you are. It's kind of nice, actually.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, from speaking from personal experience, I mean, as a keys player, I use Luptimus very regularly, and but I found it super helpful. I'd have my computer on the side, as kind of a fail safe, but like I would
Yeah,
just to be able to visually reference it, you can just exactly what's going on. You can just
yeah.
it's so much easier. Yeah, so that's a great thought.
Keep track rig in a rack mount case.
Mm.
That is mainly because I can't say how many times I've seen people kick cables out in between services,
Mm.
like someone's
Yeah.
mom comes up on stage to like give someone a hug, or the pastor's walking around doing some sort of sound check,
Oh yeah.
and no one notices that that
Hmm.
person, or someone's like 4 year old or something is running around on stage. No one notices that that person like kicked a cable out of the back of track rig. USB cable went flying, or who knows what happened. An XLR
Right.
cable broke off, or the power to track rig like popped out. And a
Oh.
rack mount case keeps all those cable connections secure and safe.
Mm.
So keep track rig in a rack mount case. I highly recommend that as well.
Yeah. 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 That's
That's a good
awesome.
question, Matt. I mean, this we're getting down now to like the nit and gritty of
Yeah.
how to actually really run this at your church. Where do you set it up? There's issues too with like keeping your iPad charged. You know,
Yeah. Right.
um, and you can buy like the splitter that works with the iPad that lets you then also charge at the same time. Because the last thing you
Yeah.
want is your iPad dying
Oh
halfway through
gosh.
a
Yeah.
set.
Yeah. It's a lot of little details, but yeah, kind of like you said, it's like every church is different, so you just gotta figure out what works
One
best. And
time, one time I went out on stage for a closing song, and the iPad like had a warning on it that was like 5% left or something, or battery's like
oh
almost
no.
dead, not charged, not plugged in. And I just like turned this brightness down. I turned off Wi-Fi, turned off iPad, or I turned off Wi-Fi, turned off Bluetooth, and
Oh
just
my gosh.
prayed the whole song that we could make it just for like another 4 or 5 minutes.
Oh man. Yep. And that's not what you don't need that. You don't need that in the middle of a
No,
of a
you
worship
don't.
service.
That's something you don't
Oh
want to have to be
man.
thinking about while you're trying to lead
No.
worship.
No, not at all. Wow. Well, yeah, that's a good story. But you made it. You survived. Hopefully everyone else
I
will
made it.
will do the same. So thanks for the tips. That's all we got for now. I don't see any other questions, but
Cool.
we'll keep this thing going. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to send them to us online. Shoot us a message, and we'll be happy to hit those next time. So Matt, thanks again for jumping on here. Good to see you.
Sounds good, Matt. Thanks. Good to
No
see you.
problem. We'll see you soon.
See you.